We are. Welcome everyone here in the room and online watching from home or anywhere. My name is Sharissa Shotu, and today we're going to discuss the right to housing because many countries all over the world are dealing with precarious housing climates. Homelessness is increasing, and affordable housing is under enormous pressure. In the recent years, due to these multiple housing crises in Europe, societal debates on housing rights have become more present. Demonstrations for more affordable and good quality housing for all have used the right to housing as a way to show the urgency of housing crises. At the same time, the right to housing is also used in policy and legal terms, all with a slight different usage and interpretation. So what does the right to housing imply? Most importantly, how do we use and apply the right to housing for a better housing climate for everyone? Housing falls under the adequate standard of living, which is a human right, but how do we create a sense of urgency in this right if this right is breached? How can we enforce these housing rights, and what are some of the steps being taken or needing to be taken? Tonight we have different experts on housing rights in the room that will explain the work they do on making them more commonly accepted and implemented. They focus both on the work that can be done internationally and in the more local, national context. At first, I have two guests with whom I talked to with Zoom. You might have seen them just a couple minutes ago. We're going to talk about the work that's being done internationally and how this impacts locally. After that, we will dive into the right of housing in the Netherlands through an activist, legal, and political lens. If there are any questions or comments after the whole program, we have some space for that. That's towards the end of the evening. Welcome. That was a whole mouthful. Please take a seat. A couple of people are still coming in. So happy to have you here, guys. Thank you so much. With me through Zoom is Leilani Farha, Global Director of the Shift, and Kim van Sparrentak, Member of the European Parliament for GroenLinks. Welcome, guys. Hi,
Thank you.
Can you hear me, Kim? Can you
Hello,
hear us?
hello.
Nice.
Yes, we can hear you.
That's nice, that's nice. Leilani, thank you so much for having you here. Can you briefly introduce yourself and the Shift?
Sure. Super happy to be here. I'm on screen with one of my favorite people in the world, Kim. It's so nice to see you. You just do tremendous work, and I just continue to be inspired by you. So lovely to be in conversation. There's another good friend of mine and colleague in the audience and is going to be on the panel next, Jan de Vries. Hello, Jan, out there. Really happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I am Leilani Farha. I'm the global director of an organization called The Shift, which is a human rights organization focused on housing, and we are international in scope. And I'm the former United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to housing, a post I held for 6 years, from 2014 until 2020, a post that took me to every region of the world and got me up close and personal with the struggles of tenants, informal dwellers, even homeowners on occasion, and put me very close in the rooms with government officials at all levels, from the local level to the national level, judges, adjudicators, investors, real estate folks. So I come to this work honestly and through a lot of hard work. The Shift is a relatively new organization. We've been around since the beginning of the pandemic, so just for 2 years. And what we're trying to do is really, if I could say this, popularize the right to housing and work both at the international level and the local level to spread greater understanding of how practical the right to housing is, what it actually means, and how it's a really useful tool in governance.
Yes, and then there was this the Shift directives, right? And its goals on better housing conditions that was recently published. It's a report that you guys have published. One of the directives, for instance, is a shift to a human rights-based housing framework. But there's also one that states regulate institutional investment in housing to comply with human rights. Many more, 10 to be precise. Can you explain to us what these directives are or mean, and what you guys want to accomplish with it?
Sure, and I had the distinct pleasure, excuse me, of launching those directives in the European Parliament, thanks to Kim She so graciously embraced the directives, so relevant to the work that she's been doing at EU level. Incredible work. I hope she speaks about that. And so we launched them there. The reason for the directives, like why did we do these directives? So I really refer to them rather with due respect, rather than as a report, they're really a set of standards. And the idea was this: look, housing is the biggest business in the world. You know, the value of housing, 200 and of housing, residential real estate across the world, 250 trillion US dollars. It's more money than any of us in that room or on the computer can imagine, right? 250 trillion. It's bigger than any other business, bigger than pharmaceuticals, bigger than gold, all the gold that's ever been mined, right? This is huge business. And since the global financial crisis, and you've seen this particularly across Europe and including in the Netherlands, we've seen a whole slew of new actors or old actors becoming way more vigorous and active in the housing space. Who am I talking about? Private equity firms, pension funds, asset management firms, real estate investment trusts. And they've started to dominate the housing landscape, and they've been doing things that make affordable, secure housing impossible in cities around the world. So they're helping to push up rents. They're making tenancies very precarious. People are being evicted or being forced to leave because they can't afford the rent. They're being displaced from their communities. So we wanted a response to this because these actors are supported by governments. Laws and policies of governments support these actors to enter this space and invade this space. So we were thinking, okay, we need to hold both governments and these actors accountable. And accountable to what? To human rights commitments that governments have made all around the world. So that's where the directives come from. Directive 1, as you rightly said, is kind of like one of the cornerstones. There are a few other cornerstone directives there, but obviously trying to compel governments to use a human rights framework at the outset, but also to increase tenant protections so that these actors are not interested in certain jurisdictions. Because if tenants are well protected, these actors can't raise rents, can't evict, can't turn modest housing into luxury housing, et cetera. But we cover a whole range of issues, too many to go into right now.
Yeah, it's a lot, that's true. But it's very good, it is here, to put it that way. Do you think the directives reach the people that you want it to reach?
They will. So it's early days. We released them in June. And we are now in the midst of trying to figure out, okay, how do we make sure that these get traction? I've been actually quite surprised. A lot of people have contacted me to say, oh, we're using your directives already, even though we haven't really laid out and rolled out our strategy. So for example, some lawyers and advocates in San Francisco and Oakland, California, one of the areas in the US that is really experiencing terrible housing conditions, very expensive housing market. They did a little scan of their policies and bylaws at city level to see whether their policies and laws are in accordance with the directives. And where they weren't, they sort of made a note. And now they're trying to get new laws at city level that would better protect people using the directives as their guidance. That's just one example. There's a group in South Africa right now really concerned with real estate investment trusts, REITs, one of these big actors, institutional investor actors, and they'll be using the directives to help inform their advocacy work with REITs. So it's early days yet. We will start doing some webinars and info sessions with investors themselves to try to get them to understand that they have human rights responsibilities.
Yeah. And where can we find the directives if we want to read them?
www.maketheshift.org.
Nice. Leilani, we'll be right back with you. Kim,
Thanks.
nice to have you here as well. You have a wonderful flag right behind you, I see.
Thank you.
Can you briefly introduce yourself and what you're doing right now?
So my name is Kim van Sparrentak. I'm a member of the European Parliament since 2019. And in this role, I had the opportunity to be the rapporteur, which is the lead negotiator on the report on access to decent and affordable housing.
Yes, that was very briefly. In January of 2021, you presented the report "Access to Decent and Affordable Housing to All" in the Parliament. Actually, can you tell us what the report was about?
Yes. So basically, we realized as an employment committee that at that point in time, and that's pre-COVID and everything, when of course it got even worse, that in every member state of the European Union, people were struggling to afford their homes, struggling to pay their rent, struggling to pay their mortgages off, and that housing had become just something to play with for profit rather than being established as a right. And also it felt a bit that the right to make a profit was bigger than or stood higher than the right to housing. And that's why we wrote a report looking at several aspects. And it's always a bit awkward to talk about housing in a European context because officially housing is a member state competence. We are not in charge of housing in the European Union, but there's a lot of rules and regulations that have impact on housing. So we actually just said, okay, we're going to look at all those rules and we're going to see where we can actually help people and municipalities and local governments to actually, secure the right to housing. When we looked at certain things, we looked at homelessness, for example. And for homelessness, we really looked at making sure that in the whole European Union, we get a shift from what is the current, status quo, managing or ignoring basically homelessness, to ending homelessness, to solving homelessness. So that was one of the strong calls we did. Then we really looked at financialization. So this whole thing about, how do we make sure that this right to make a profit, which is something that's very prevalent in the European internal market, how do we make sure that we tackle that at least we get more transparency on who owns our housing, but also how we tackle, for example, such things as Airbnb, where housing is just being shifted into quick profit making and illegal hotels. And then lastly, because it was not only access to decent, affordable housing, but also access to decent housing. And of course, I'm also a green. We really looked at, sustainability of housing, making sure that we try to combat energy poverty in Europe and that people live in healthy homes, that they don't have to worry about the mold on the walls, but that, the right to housing is not only ensuring that someone has a roof over their head, that they can afford the roof, but also that they can heat it and that they can live in it without being worried that they get sick.
Yeah, well, it's these things that the things that you're saying right now are, of course, human rights, and that's it, right? So it feels like you're saying something special, but it should be normal to have these things, right? So I'm wondering how the Parliament actually received your report then.
Well, the draft report was received quite as a radical initiative, especially because I decided to talk about legislation that was not purely within the remit of the social affairs committees, because we, for example, talked about the economic governance, we talked about state aid rules and all these things. So it was considered quite radical, but in the end, we noticed that, everywhere they felt that this housing crisis was so big that they were willing to push further and also willing to actually accept quite a radical report that we then could use to talk to the Commission and to member states to further enforce the right to housing.
Yeah, but why would I say it's radical if it's basic human rights? I'm wondering.
Because unfortunately in the European Parliament, as of course in the Dutch Parliament, we don't have a left-wing majority. We have quite a conservative right-wing majority. And when it comes to making profits and protecting corporations, that is something that they're always more willing to fight for than the rights of people, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's sad, actually.
Yeah.
It's almost 2 years since you've actually presented the report. Are there already any best practices of the impact this all had on European level? I'm wondering.
Yes, definitely. Well, one thing actually is that I think we continue to work with Leilani. You said so many nice things about me, but I think what the work you've been doing is been amazing too. And even this morning, when I spoke with some Irish housing activists, they asked, "How do we implement the right to housing?" I immediately said, "Go to the shift and find out how Leilani has proposed to do it." So that's one of the things we did. We really pushed further, and we opened this discussion more on the right to housing. Then on homelessness, we called for a goal to end homelessness by 2030, and everyone said, "You're crazy. No one's going to endorse a goal to end homelessness by 2030." But then a few months later, actually, every single member state and the European Commission is now committed to it, that we are going to work towards the goal to end homelessness by 2030. So I'm very proud of that.
Yeah.
And then in 2 weeks, actually, there will also be new legislation coming to make sure that we can target short-term rentals such as Airbnb better, and can make sure that illegal hotels will disappear. So these are a few things that we've already managed to get going on a European level.
Nice, doing the work out there, Kim.
Yes. It's hard work. It's pushing a lot, but then you get something.
Sounds good. Leilani, what are some of the biggest obstacles you both, actually, I want to hear it from you both, but you both encounter in realizing decent and affordable housing? Because in the publication of the shift, you can read the words institutional investors very, very many times. How do they create the obstacles? You kind of said it already, but...
Yeah, I mean, that is one of the biggest obstacles, is what we call the financialization or uber commodification of housing. And it's the business model, and it's people always mistake what I say. It's not that I think there's no room for housing in the private market. That's not quite correct. That's not what I think. But it's gone berserk, we could say. It's like on steroids, So what's happened is the business model is one that's based on pretty high returns over a short period of time. And the way in which those are guaranteed is by raising rents and by creating units that maybe were once modest and then doing some cosmetic, upgrades, and then increasing the rents to make them into luxury, which is not what people need. The average person who's renting doesn't have a big income, right? They need just an affordable, decent place to live. So the business model itself is problematic. The business model is supported by domestic laws and policies. Real estate investment trusts, for example, are not taxed as corporations, although they really are just corporations. And they are generally publicly traded. So, and there are other companies that are publicly traded and get tax exemptions. So the person who buys shares in the company may pay income tax, but the company itself doesn't. And that enables them to operate the way they do. So that's one big, whole area of problematic in terms of realizing the right to housing. And they're really unregulated. So, Kim was talking about some of the standards. So they're just not regulated, and they're not regulated using the human right to housing. So that then flips to the other big barrier, which is accountability. Yeah. Who is accountable to whom at this point? Right now, governments are making themselves accountable to investors, and that's got to stop. And investors make themselves accountable to their investors. So, the real estate investment trust has a whole bunch of investors that it's representing, and they put those investors first. They say, oh, we have a fiduciary duty to other investors rather than a human rights duty to tenants. And so governments aren't being held accountable for their human rights commitments that they've made at international and regional level. And the big actors are not being held accountable either. So those, to me, are the big pieces that have to be addressed.
Yeah, Kim, I see you nodding actually every time when Leilani says something. Do you recognize this, what she's saying?
Very much. And I think I think that is definitely one aspect. And also, the fact that especially on the European level, you see how much money they're putting into lobbying, for their rights. That's really one of the problematic parts. And then I think another thing, which I find quite ironic, is that there's still this very strong mantra in the European Union that the market will solve everything. Although I think that actually housing is the example where we have all proven collectively that the market is not going to provide for a decent and affordable home for everyone. But I think that those two things together, indeed, the very strong, powerful, profit-making machines, combined with this mantra that the market still will solve some things, is really a big hurdle.
Yeah, yeah. And how will you fight it? Or are you going to fight it?
Well, one of the things I think that is maybe a bit geeky, but I think it is very interesting, is that we are now going to set standards on what a social investment is in the European Union. We did that already. We're working on doing that for what is a sustainable investment. So really to make sure that an investor, when they claim we are investing sustainably, that they dare hold to some standards. And we want to do the same thing now for social. And in the initial proposal, it was, if you invest in housing, that's a social investment. Mm-hmm. And that's, of course, ludicrous, because that can also mean that if you invest to penthouses for the rich and just leave them empty and use them to speculate, that's a social investment. Mm-hmm. So this is one of those areas where we're really trying to fight that and really try to make sure that, we shift that idea of just housing as a thing in a market. We're really trying to make that something where you can push towards something more social.
Yeah, yeah. So Kim, you're working more on a European level, and Leilani's more on like a global level. But what do your reports and actually work as well are bringing like to the national and local context? Can you see that or notice that it's working, or how does that go?
Yeah. So is it me that's supposed to speak?
Sure.
Yeah. So the whole point of what we do is at the shift, and even when I was rapporteur, is to look at what's happening on the ground and the patterns across the world. So for example, we've seen this pattern of financialization. It's not just in Europe. It's not just in North America. It's in many, many places in Latin America. It's emerging in Africa. We're seeing it in Asia. So, and even the Middle East. So international work should be like this. It's not always, it isn't always, but it should be. So you survey what's happening on the ground at the most local level. And then you take from that and try to imagine what would global standards look like using international human rights law. Then you create those standards based on those local experiences. And then you hope and you work to make sure that the global standards you've established are being used at the local level. So you should envision it like a circle. So here's the local and everyone's working, and there's lots of problems down here and there's lots of solutions being proposed. We take that, we bring it to global level, we globalize it, and then we hope that it gets back down to the ground. That's how it should work. And so that's the process that I'm in with the right to housing, constantly like this, round and round, with some successes. I think if I track back to when I started at global level as UN rapporteur in 2014, I think we're in a very different place now with the right to housing. I think there's a real fluency that's emerging, deep concern. I think now people say quite readily, there is a global housing crisis. It is a human rights crisis. I hope that I've contributed to that. So, through this kind of work that I described.
Yes, of course. And now there's one thing we cannot forget when we talk about the right to housing, and that is, of course, the right for undocumented people and their housing, actually. Do they equally benefit from the work on housing rights as well, or is that a whole different side?
Do you want me to talk or Kim? I think we probably both have experience.
Yeah, maybe you can start, Leilani,
sure.
And I can add.
Sure. Of course, it equally applies. It applies to everyone in every situation and every condition. It's one of the things always forgotten, in situations of conflict, for example, human rights are more important than ever, not less important. Migrants and refugees who arrive new into a country absolutely have the right to housing. It's not without complications. I understand that well, because you often will have a domestic population that is equally unhoused, poorly housed, homeless, etc. But it's not okay to only allow for the local national population to have access to services and to housing programs, and to deny that to migrants and refugees. What often doesn't happen is intergovernmental efforts, so that those who are so government officials who are accepting and on the immigration side or migrant side aren't always talking to government officials who are on the housing side. And there has to be a coming together of that, of those policies, along with finance, of course. I'll stop there.
Kim, can you,
Yeah, well, I mean, I can say, like, you know, one of the things that, you know, we've been pushing for is this goal to end homelessness. And that's, I know that this is being used because it has been endorsed by the European Commission and by member states. It has been used by organizations working with undocumented migrants to say, look, there is a goal to end homelessness. So this is for everyone in Europe. But I have to be honest, also when I was trying to talk about this topic during the writing of my report, it was just incredibly complicated. I think already the discussion on whether legal migrants should have access to housing in other member states or to shelter even was already a contentious topic for a lot of my a lot of my colleagues. So unfortunately, however, I wished I could have pushed way further in the European Parliament. The reality right now is just very hostile towards many people, and also when it comes to the right to housing. But I think that that it's therefore very good that we're talking about it more and that we keep fighting for it more, and that we make sure that we also don't talk only about them but with them, and that we keep pushing for the right to housing for everyone.
Yeah, well, Leilani and Kim, thank you so much. Hang in there, and thanks for the work. Can I have a little applause for these two? Kim and Leilani are staying around online, so you can ask them any questions if you want later on tonight. Our next conversation has a goal that I hope we'll find the answers to, but seeing the people in front of me, I think that'll be okay. We want to formulate concrete steps on how to apply and reinforce the right to housing in the Netherlands. With me here is Jan de Vries, Dutch representative at the Shift. Can you come sit over here? Then we have Rosa Beets, human rights lawyer at PILP. And then we have Hidaya Nampima, co-founder of the Amsterdam City Rights and LGBTQ+ activist, and Mustafa Essouyen, I hope I say that right, Recht op de Stad, Housing Movement Rotterdam. Welcome and happy to have you here. Thank you. Let's start with a little introduction round. I think that's the most important thing. Mustafa, can you tell us who you are and what you're doing right now?
Yes, I'm Mustafa Essouyen. I am one of the founding members of Right to the City of Rotterdam, together with a lot of other people. There are scientists among us, artists. Currently work in Parliament, Dutch Parliament, and I'm an activist.
Nice. Need you out here. Thank you. Hidaya, can you introduce yourself?
My name is Hidaya Nampima. I am originally from Uganda. I am undocumented. I am the co-founder of Amsterdam City Rights that was formed by undocumented people as well as documented people to see that our voices are heard. I represent the queer community, the children who have been in limbo for quite a long time, and also I try to uplift my voice to be heard because most of the time undocumented people are being regarded as invisible.
Thank you so much for being here and letting your voice be heard. Jan, you're next up.
Yes, my name is Jan de Vries. I'm a Dutch representative of the Shift. Leilani already presented the organization, obviously. At a global level, at a national level, I'm doing the work Leilani does at the global level, which is try and popularize the right to housing in the Netherlands, give it content as well from a legal and political perspective. And besides my work for the Shift, I work a lot with organizations who work with homeless people and also apply a right to housing perspective to their work.
Yes, and Rosa?
Hi, my name is Rosa Beets. I work as a lawyer in Amsterdam for a human rights organization, and we conduct strategic litigation for all kinds of progressive movements in the Netherlands. So we use the law as a tool amongst other tools.
That's a very good one. Thank you. Now, Jan, you already told a little about what the shift is doing in the Netherlands, but can you maybe be more concrete about that, or what do we have to think about?
Even more concrete.
More. I need all the details.
Yes, I think the idea of launching a shift in the Netherlands was very much inspired by the movement, which Mustafa is part of also, obviously, and there are some activists here in the public as well. Which is that the right to housing is used as a political slogan, as a rallying cry for a movement. We see it also being used in the media more and more, and recht op wonen. We see it even being used in politics by members of parliament, and now almost every time he speaks by Hugo de Jonge, the Minister of Housing. And the inspiration came from the fact that it's really great to have it as a political rallying cry, because I think that's a function also of human rights. It's a way to give voice to people who have less power, to give voice to certain forms of injustice. So it's very political. But then when you get into the nitty-gritty of what does it mean concretely, how should we apply it, what does it mean for policies, what does it mean for legislation, I think you need to have a little bit more understanding of the normative framework, which is also the strength of human rights, and particularly also the right to housing, and understand what it means, in essence, the right to adequate housing. So I'm trying to also use my knowledge to translate the treaties, whatever is in the treaties, the work that Leilani has been doing as a special rapporteur and our colleagues have been doing in standard setting, in explaining this is what the duties of government are, these are the rights of the people, and this is how you can apply it in policies, in strategy development, etc. Yeah. I'm trying to apply that in the Netherlands.
Yeah. How is Hugo actually doing? Wondering.
How is Hugo doing?
He has quite the reputation, so I was like, well, you named him, so.
Yeah, well, I think from the outside, I mean, the first public statement he did in Parliament started with Article 22, sub 2 of the Constitution, which is the right to housing, and indicating that he feels he has a duty to respect, protect, and fulfill that right, which already is, in terms of language, is like a sort of a complete shift, which I think is important. Then you note a few things that he's saying about more affordable housing, about rent control, about having specific attention for these, what we call aandachtsgroepen, specific groups who are particularly vulnerable, I think, with regard to housing, homelessness. As a Secretary of State van Ooyen, who also talks about the right to housing a lot, and they work together. But then, and there is a but, but then you look at what he actually does, and you look at some of the programs and some of the intention and how it works out and where his priorities lie. And it's all a little bit of right to housing and a little bit not. And that's my main criticism, I think, of Hugo de Jonge. And it's where I think I feel a lot also with the housing rights movement. I think we really need a total shift, a systemic change from looking at housing as a commodity to housing as a right. And that means also a shift in the system. It doesn't mean tweaking the system as it is now and using the right to housing as a way to sort of facilitate that, or using the right to housing to legitimize that tweaking of the system. And I think a few choices that he's made and a few policy decisions, and in terms of legislation, especially now, for example, on rent control, show that I think he thinks it's a sort of a menu of choice. It's sort of a la carte. You can pick out some stuff and then like call it right to housing. And that's not how it works.
No.
So my overall mark would be 5 on 10. Like, it's a good effort at this moment. There is some positive signs, but we're absolutely not there yet, and he really needs to show more.
Yeah. You think he will?
No, I think for me at this moment, one of the big battling grounds is the rent control. And there he's, from what we see and what we hear, he's giving into the market much more than he should be doing.
Yeah.
Legally, he could do much more. The borders are much more wider than the ones he's seemingly taken in the sort of legislative proposal that's probably coming up.
Yeah, yeah. If I ask you to briefly talk about the status of the housing rights in the Netherlands, I think briefly is maybe not working, but if you can you maybe tell us about it?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the main indicators for the right to housing in any country is the level of homelessness.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly also the level of number of people who are marginally housed. But certainly homelessness is an absolute important indicator. And you see in the Netherlands that the official figures that we have show that it's doubled between 2009 and 2019. It's sort of like stabilized now at a certain level, somewhere between 35, 40,000. But those are official statistics. We know it's a complete underestimation. We know the definition applied by official statistics is just too small.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I'm looking at Cody Hossenbach, who's here in the crowd also. He's launched this number of 100,000 homeless. I think that's much closer to reality.
Okay.
And there is a negative trend. So it's rising and rising and rising because more and more people are finding it difficult to afford their housing.
Mm-hmm.
More and more people have difficulties accessing housing. There's a lot of discrimination on housing. So at that, looking at just that indicator, you have to say that looking at the right to housing in the Netherlands, it's not going well. And then when you look at what we just discussed, the sort of policy decisions that are being made and the sort of legislation that's being made, that's by far not enough to tackle these sort of crises, to make sure that everybody has access to what Kim already said a few times, to decent and affordable housing.
Yeah, yeah. Hidayah, how is this housing crisis affecting undocumented people?
I think being undocumented is one of the saddest things I have ever faced in Netherlands as a whole. And who creates undocumented people is the system, the asylum system that has completely failed almost everybody to acquire a decent living. Many people in Amsterdam, where I have lived for 5 years, are really fighting to see that they could have a place. As I talk about the genesis of the shelters, where before we had the BBBs, that is bed, bread, and bath, we used to have those inadequate places, but at least we knew we have a place to sleep. And then there was advancement of the LVV program, where at least people would work on perspective. But what is the criteria of someone getting a place in the LVV program? They have to assess your vulnerability for you to have a place. What criteria they use for someone to have a place is something that we don't get to know. On a daily, my group, Amsterdam City Rights, we are faced with a number of people, especially women and children, who are looking for places. And you know how hard it is to house someone who has a baby or who has a child or who has a minor. Housing as a human right has been violated for people like myself. We have been dehumanized. We have been degraded to the extent that sometimes if you're able to get a shelter, there are conditions that are being imposed on you. Probably we are giving you this shelter because we feel right now you're sick, but as soon as you get better, you will have to move out. So it's for you to worry all the time that maybe I am having this place for just a couple of weeks or months, and then I'm back on the streets.
Yeah.
Many people are homeless simply because the system has not really acknowledged the visibility of people without papers.
Yeah. And well, you're part of Amsterdam City Rights, a co-founder. What is Amsterdam City Rights doing for these people?
Well, Amsterdam City Rights, first of all, is being represented by myself. Every time I get a chance to talk about our demands, I always talk about the challenges that we face on the daily. So Amsterdam City Rights has created a platform where we try to interact with the politicians, with the civil servants, and then some of the policy makers to see that at least our voice is being heard. Besides that, we also have some of our partners who sometimes take in people like myself or take in women and children to house them. But even then, the space that they have is not like a long-term space. Housing someone needs a lot of money also. I would talk about the Ukrainian crisis that happened. I saw how many Dutch people came on board. I saw the solidarity that almost the whole of Netherlands have. I saw how much everybody came on board. We never see this happen. We don't see it anywhere. The solidarity that you show to all other people should be the same solidarity that is shown to people even if they don't have blonde hair, even if they don't have blue eyes. So Amsterdam City Rights will continue to have a voice. We'll continue to talk about most of the problems that are happening to us. And this can only be done if we get platforms like this to talk about some of the challenges and the problems that are endless in society.
Yeah, well, I think that deserves a round of applause. Thank you, Hidaya. For how long have you been in Amsterdam, if I can ask?
Approximately, if I remember, since 2018, February. So close to 5 years now.
Close to 5 years. Yeah. And so you've seen differences between how they treated refugees coming in around 2016 and refugees that are coming in right now. What are the biggest differences?
The biggest difference, I'll talk about briefly about when Afghanistan had a problem. I know so many countries did not open up. They said they don't have space. But when catastrophe struck in Ukraine, everybody came on board. Everybody showed concern. Everybody showed that they really do care. That was very heartening. It was very painful because I know some of my friends who have been looking for shelter for the last 1 year and nobody has taken them in. I also heard that there were some benefits that the Ukrainians were supposed to get, like going to the zoo for free. Not so many of us have been to the zoo and the museums. And then also they used not to pay some transport fares in the trams. Many of my friends are in detention. Why? The system does not allow us to work. What does it mean? That some people will go in the trains or in the metro without paying. The consideration that you give to other people, the welcome that you give to other people should be the same welcome that we live to see. Because I believe we all have the same hemoglobin. I believe all of us reason the same way, and categorizing people is really dehumanization and racism.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Hidaya. We'll get back to you later on. Rosa, you're from PILP. You've mentioned that earlier. Can you talk to us a little bit about what they do?
Yes, we are a law firm / NGO that conducts strategic litigation, which means that we try to work with movements, NGOs, activists, organizations in the Netherlands that are involved in one form or struggle or another, for one human rights topic or another, and that we see whether sometimes the struggle is already being fought with many means, so for example protests or campaigns or on a political level, and sometimes a legal case can actually help that struggle a bit further, and sometimes it cannot. So if we think that a legal case might be strategic to further the aims of the broader movement and struggle, then we do that case, and we build it.
Yeah. And since you're a lawyer, so I can ask you this, why do people see basic housing rights not as human rights?
I'm not sure if that's so much a legal question as much as a political question. So as we heard already many times, that the human right to housing is a human right. And I think it's rather a political choice not to treat it as such.
Yeah, yeah. What are you, or the legal steps you take or strategies you use to enforce the right to decent housing?
Well, I think we have been talking about a case on a right to housing with many experts and with the movement and with activists and with academics already for a few years. And I think for now we think it's just fairly difficult to build such a case. So many people have asked us, when is this big climate case on housing coming, so to say? And I always, as also part of my job, have to say, well, I think it's very difficult and complicated. And I think the reasons for that are many. It's mostly legal reasons. Should I talk about that now, or maybe for a later?
You can talk about it. Yeah,
I think a few things are a bit difficult for the right to housing. So one of the main points is it's always difficult. You cannot ask a judge everything, right? So the point is a bit, what in a case on the right to housing would you be able to ask the judge? And the way that the right to housing is formulated in the Constitution, but also in most international treaties that we've been talking about, it's formulated in a bit of a different wording than, for example, the right to vote or the right of assembly or the right to life. Or it's not so much you have the right to housing. It's mostly formulated as the government is obliged to make sure, and now my English translation is failing me, but to ensure working towards creating a right to housing for all. It's rather vague, so to say. And that means that in a legal case, it's difficult to ask the judge, well, just order the state to make better housing policy. That's just not how the legal system works.
No.
So that's one problem. Another one that makes it a bit difficult is that, at least in legal thinking, there is this distinction, so to say, on classical rights, as the ones I just mentioned, right to vote, right to life, and others, and socio-economic rights, such as the right to housing, right to health, which are formulated in this different manner. And I don't say I necessarily agree with that distinction, because I think without food you also die, so what's really the point?
Yeah.
But that does matter in legal practice, so many judges are also a bit hesitant when it comes to the socio-economic rights to actually apply those in practice. And it's difficult for citizens and also organizations to directly enforce that right to housing in a legal case.
Yeah, because it's also vaguely written.
Partly, also because it's vaguely written. But that doesn't mean that the right is useless. So as my perspective is very narrow, I would say, because I only look at, can we build this in a legal case and can we enforce it in a court of law? But that doesn't mean that the right to housing does not have a function, as we have already heard, in parliament, in politics, in activism, etc.
Yeah. So in the Tweebosbuurt, Mustafa Pilp was helping you out there too. But can you talk to us a bit about what happens in the Tweebosbuurt? It's in Rotterdam.
Yeah. Well, I met Rosa for the first time about the case of the Tweebosbuurt. Tweebosbuurt is a small neighborhood in the south of Rotterdam. Our neighborhood is demolished at this moment, and Pilp, Rosa Bates and her colleagues stood by us by sending a letter to the higher court in The Hague. We lost the case, but there's an appeal to the Supreme Court, and Vestia, our housing corporation, wanted to demolish our houses, so and they were applying to the housing vision of the municipality, and we were displaced, and we are now living. A lot of us are now living in the neighborhood nearby, but not in the same area.
Yeah.
So that's the case of the Tweebosbuurt.
Yeah, and you guys had to leave from the Tweebosbuurt. Is it because there were coming houses for like more rich people, or was it still social housing? Or
no, this neighborhood is gentrified, so the social houses are demolished, and they are building the higher, expensive houses in the higher segment, like 1,200 euros a month, and housing prices of 500,000 euros a piece. So it's not for the lower income groups, but only for the higher income groups.
And what does it do to the people that were living there at first? Because I'm from an area where social housing is like, I grew up in like, how do you say it, neighborhoods with a lot of social houses, and I always liked the fact that it was so socially, right? So you always had someone who was taking care of you, or the other way around. How is that now in the neighborhood?
Well, the community is no longer there, so the social network is demolished. It's not only the houses they demolish, but they demolish the whole community. People who are depending on their neighborhoods, they are not finding their neighbors anymore because they're living somewhere else. So the community is totally vanished.
Yeah. And what are your next steps as an activist? Because I don't think you'll let it be like this, or...
No. As a member of Right to the City, we started here just last year, talking to local politicians and housing corporations about the right to housing. But what we saw is that they do not know what the right to housing contains. So we are, with the knowledge that Jan and Leilani provides, we use that knowledge to convince them about the right to housing. So we are starting now just 1 year and 6 months ago. So it's still early to say we are making big steps ahead. So.
Yeah. How are you doing, actually? Because it can be hard, of course.
Yeah, it was a hard time because activism eats a lot of energy. Because I was sometimes 20 hours a day working on this case. So it's been a hard time.
Yeah, I can imagine. Now, how was PILP, actually, what was the role of PILP in the fight for the Tweebosbuurt?
We were not the lawyers of the Tweebosbuurt people, so that's to be said. But as I said already a few years ago, we had started to look at the right to housing and whether we could build a case around that. And then came to the conclusion that we thought, well, big case is difficult, but it would be good if we could take some small steps and to make sure that this right to housing is actually entangled a bit further in Dutch jurisprudence, and that if we have some positive jurisprudence, we can build further on that, maybe towards a bigger case afterwards. So then I think in January 2020, the judgment or a judgment of a first instance court of the Tweebosbuurt came out, and that was actually a really good judgment because the judge really took into account the fact that this group of people were losing their homes, and that the right to housing was part of the couldn't be left out of that process, and actually prohibited Vestia to evict those people. So that's when the judgment caught our eye. We thought, well, this is very important that the judgment also keeps being around at the appeal court, that it stays. So we wrote a letter, some sort of expert letter, because the case was already ongoing, to the court to try to convince the court to take that right to housing into the legal judgment that had to be made. Unfortunately, that didn't work. So I think the appeals judgment really sucks. And I think that actually might work against us also now, but we tried. Yeah.
You tried, that's important. So we kind of heard of all sides, right? We had the undocumented, we had social housing, we had homelessness. Jan, what is needed to bring the right to housing a step further in the Netherlands? I mean, Rosa really tried, as you could hear.
Yeah, no, I think the legal battle continues, and it's really important. I think first and foremost, it's also about knowledge and about understanding what the right to housing really means. And a first step is to assess every single policy, every single piece of legislation at a local level, at a regional level, at a national level, against that human rights framework. And just continuously keep dropping, this is your duty, this is where it's going wrong, this is where you're not respecting, protecting, or fulfilling the right to housing enough. Keep monitoring it. So that means you need to have knowledge at the local, regional, and national level. You need to understand, you need to use the rights language in your advocacy. And then, of course, the next step is to try and find a way of making sure that the right to housing actually becomes the basis of a housing strategy. So it's the point of departure, and it's the end goal. It's to make sure everybody has the right access to the right to adequate housing. But for me, the first step is for certainly for activists, but also within government, for politicians, civil servants, to get a better grasp of at least parts of the right to housing and start getting a more of a human rights reflex when they're talking about legislation, when they're talking about policy. The first step has already been done, the first small step, which is that the right to housing is omnipresent. I think 5 years ago, somebody would shout right to housing and still be quite, lonely. But now it's everywhere. So the language is there, which is always the first step. And now it's really getting that normative framework and maybe a little bit of the nerdy, as Kim said, nitty gritty understanding of parts of that framework. And if Hugo de Jonge talks about rent control, put it against the framework, try and assess, is this really doing enough to respect, protect, and fulfill the right to housing? If not, use the rights language and advocate.
Yeah. Hidayah, what do you think about this? How do you think we can take the right to housing a step further in the Netherlands?
Well, housing shouldn't be just a roof over you. Housing should be a place where you feel you have all the freedom. Housing should be a place where you feel very independent. We have quite a number of undocumented people that are kind of deviating from us. Like we have the Filipino community, the Asians, the Brazilian, and then we also have the migrant workers. The migrant workers are some of the people who try to help communities here by trying to do some of the domestic work. These people are able to earn some money and kind of rent some houses, but the system does not permit them to rent these particular places. So we find most of the times that our people have been exploited. For instance, you can rent some money to someone who is also sub-renting the house, and then someone else with a higher pay comes to this person and they will deny you. You will not have any ways of kind of reporting this person. So the system should be in a way that it's not just having a roof over you. It's having a place where you feel secured. It's having a place where you can decide who you want to stay with. A couple of months ago, I was actually attacked by someone I have stayed with for at least a year. But I knew from her actions she never liked me. But she attacked me in the middle of the night where I could not even have anything to do. And she told me a lot of hateful words that I cannot even disclose here, right? So like we sometimes do not choose who you want to stay with. And the system does not also give you the permission to kind of negotiate some of the terms that you want to live with. So I think there should be a way that people are assessed, not just saying because someone comes from a safe country, I may be coming from a safe country, but the reason for me to come to the Netherlands may not be permitting me to stay there. So there shouldn't really be a lot of criteria. This one has this one falls here. We should always be treated equally. Right.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Mustafa, how do you think Leilani's and Kim's work is contributing to a further step in housing rights in the Netherlands?
Yeah, we tried it with Woonopstand, is Housing Uprise, is a new movement also here in Holland. And we are working on a new vision document. And the central theme of that document is the right to housing. And we use the directives of the shift, but also the work of Jan. We, how do you say that in English? Adequate housing has several characteristics, and we apply that to the Dutch situation. So we talk about affordability, accessibility, and those kinds of things.
Yeah. So Kim and Leilani are still in the Zoom, I think. I see them, but I don't think you see them. They'll be here anytime soon, I hope. Hello.
I see them there.
Yeah, they're right behind us, but we want them in front of us, I guess. Oh, there they are. Nice. Leilani and Kim, I hope you've been listening to what my guests have been saying. And I was wondering, Leilani, maybe first, how can we bring the right to housing further in the Netherlands? Since you've heard some examples that maybe should be really, how do you say it? Yeah, oh, Kim's lights are going out. Kim has a party going on there.
It went romantic on us. So, I mean, you're doing all the right things. I would, first of all, I think the panelists were amazing. And I love the way the right to housing is being integrated into actions and thoughts and ideas and reality. So it was a privilege to be listening in. The one thing I would say is, I was thinking about, and I'm sorry, now I'm forgetting everyone's name, but I think it's Rosa, with your legal adventures, shall we say. And, I myself am a legal practitioner. I've done some important test cases here in my own country, one of which was kind of a huge failure and has been used against our movements for the right to housing in many different ways. And so there's always that risk. But, when you were talking, it just dawned on me that, these mechanisms, of course, these courts weren't really set up in any way to deal, for example, with the realities of Mustafa and Hidayah, right? Like they're just like not intended for people experiencing severe housing disadvantage and violations of the right to housing. They're not even set up for social and economic rights in some senses, which makes me wonder sometimes whether we should be trying at local level to create new mechanisms for accountability. And something that's not court-like. And we've done that in Canada. It's early days here. We did, and so far things are faltering a little bit, but I won't dwell in the negative, but only to say, we've set up almost like an ombuds, but the person they're called a federal housing advocate. The problem is they were appointed by government, and so you can imagine the problems with that. But they have the capacity to research and expose housing rights violations. And then there's a council that can create a panel to adjudicate a claim. I could, go into more details about how it all works, but just to say, the New Zealand Human Rights Commission is trying really hard also to create some kind of mechanisms to hold government accountable. And there's other jurisdictions doing the same thing. And I just think that maybe we need to be very creative around accountability mechanisms, because the existing mechanisms are so alienating, cumbersome, and used against us, and really not, I just think, not responsive to our kinds of claims. So that was just one thought. I had many thoughts. There's so much, so rich.
I can imagine. Yeah, of course. Kim, what can we learn from these Dutch cases you just heard in the international context of the housing crisis in Europe?
Well, I think, basically everything that we are trying to do in the European level comes from this, more local information. And I think particularly when we're talking about, indeed, how do we implement this right to housing? How do we enforce it? How do we make sure that it becomes a thing? I think it's very important, and this is what I'm taking away from here. Like there's of course two aspects. There's the very direct, immediate right to housing, the needs of people who don't have a place or who are being evicted. And then you have, the more long-term, really restructuring the structures that are creating these problems around housing and the right to housing. And I think it's very important that, we keep focusing on both. And this is something that I'm also doing in the European Parliament, but like what I'm hearing now again is like, it confirms that's the right way. So first, we're trying to, change this whole financialization to make sure that the investment regulations are different. But at the same time, we are trying to make sure that there will be money to make sure we can have a moratorium on evictions all over Europe, because I think that is one of the things that we have to discuss right now. people will lose their homes the coming winter because they cannot afford either their rent or their energy bills. And I think it's very important that we start talking about, okay, we should have a moratorium on evictions if we also want to end homelessness in the end. And we should have a moratorium on the end on cutting off people's energy as well, because it's just, the right to housing also encompasses making sure you're not energy poor and you can heat up your house. Yeah. So I think that's I think, really making sure you always have those two things in mind, not only the big structural change, but also the immediate responses. That is something I'm taking away from your discussion.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, are there any questions from here, maybe for our
While
guests?
you're looking for questions, can I just pop one more thing into the discussion? Is that all right?
Wait for like 5 minutes because I saw
Okay.
a question right here. So let's do that one on the first row, and then in the gray sweater. Oh, there's a question right here.
Hi, my name is Willem, and I was wondering, focusing on the Lisbon Declaration on ending homelessness, maybe for Kim and also for Rosa, how can we use this in the Dutch context in a political way, and maybe also in a legal way to help those who are responsible?
Rosa, Kim can go first.
Well, I know that have been already some organizations who went with this Lisbon Declaration to their city council, for example, said, hey, I'm looking at your new budget, and you're not going to, put money into more housing first projects, which is actually something that is recommended and has been agreed because we are working towards ending homelessness by 2030. So that is one of the things that you can do. You can actually use this and say, hey, there is this goal. And then I think that is something very tangible you can do on the local level to shift, as I said, this, managing homelessness towards ending homelessness. And then I think on a national level, we really have to continue pushing that indeed there will be budget for it. And that we can make sure that it is implemented. And the Dutch government signed it. So, let's make sure that they actually do something with it. And it's a nice piece of paper to have to say, look, this is what you committed to. And also there's now going to be the proposal to have plans. So every member state will have to deliver a plan on how they want to end homelessness. This is still very much at the early stage, and it's really not that concrete yet. But that will be also a next step where we can then say, hey, you have said that you're committed to this. So I think it is a very nice way to get some leverage.
I think from a more legal perspective, the answer is always a bit more pessimistic. But if I would build a case on homelessness, which I also think would be interesting to think further about, because as Jan was already saying in the beginning, the fact that homelessness is only increasing, that in itself is something that triggers me, and I think, well, maybe it's something we can think a bit further about. How far does the government's obligation go there? So I would certainly use the declaration as supportive evidence of, you see, actually what we're asking, Judge, it's not really a big issue because the government itself acknowledges that this is the case. But it's certainly not enough to build a case, because those type of declarations, I think on purpose, they're mostly formulated in such terms that they're not really a legal obligation, but rather an expression of an expression of but I would certainly use it. Yeah.
You have an answer? Yes. There's a question right there.
What's your opinion about temporary housing for target audiences like students or asylum seekers? That kind of things, they're trying to solve.
Yeah, for who is the question?
Yeah, actually,
for everyone. Jan?
I think it's a big discussion, right? The temporary housing, flex woningen, certainly in the homelessness sector, because that's one of the target audience, is a way, and very short term, possibly, to create a little bit more breathing room also in the shelter system, and to make sure that people can get out of the shelter system into some sort of a home. So it's a short-term solution, and it can only make sense if there is a structural solution under it, which means that people who are accessing now the temporary housing will have access to housing and security of tenure for a longer period in a sustainable way. I think there is a huge problem, and I have to say that with a few organizations that I support also who work on homelessness, they get more and more calls now of people who are in either temporary locations, like on youth contracts, or on just temporary contracts, like that are being facilitated by legislation here in the Netherlands, who are at the end of the contract and do not have a housing solution, which means that some of them were homeless, got a temporary contract, and now are being made homeless again because of this temporary solution. So for me, temporary housing, yes, on a short term, can be a relief, but not without a structural solution underneath.
There's another question, right? Did you have your answer, by the way? I don't know, sir. Hi. Did you have your answer? No? I know. Some hello? Hi. You? Yeah. Hi. Did you have your answer? Do you want to?
Yes, that's something, but also about, for example, students. Oh, sorry. Also about, for example, students. They try. Yeah, it's quite risky to start up a study, but if they stop with their studies or finish their studies, then afterwards they don't have a solution actually, because they're not a target audience anymore.
Yeah.
So what's your opinion about that?
I think Jan, you can participate in that.
Yeah, maybe somebody else wants to, but
if someone has
one of the main characteristics of the right to housing, one of the main criteria is the security of tenure, right? You don't have it, it's going to be a problem. It doesn't mean you have unlimited access to sustainable housing, but if in this case again the larger problem is that there is just not enough decent, affordable housing, and you work only with temporary contracts, you are kind of uitstel van executie, we call it in the Netherlands, right? You, for a limited amount of time, you maybe have a solution. It poses a potentially very stressful situation because the deadline comes nearer and nearer, and you know that if there is not a structural solution, and there isn't in the Netherlands because decent and affordable housing is not something that's being built in great numbers, then it's just that. It's stressful, and it doesn't create a sustainable solution. So in that context, like in the context in which we are in the Netherlands, temporary housing as such is not a structural solution.
And it drives up prices as well.
Yes.
Next question?
Dankjewel. I'm Winfried. And it's probably a question for Jan. You put some energy in Hugo de Jonge, but I think he's not of great importance. About 80-90% of solving the problems on the housing issue can be done by the city councils. They own the ground, they make the laws, they make the plans. They often don't know they have this power and possibility. So the solution is mostly on city level.
Yes, certainly. I mean, Mustafa can certainly answer much better than me, but I know I responded to the question, how is Hugo? I think he's just doing fine. I saw him last in an interview again. But
he's always doing an interview somewhere.
Just before the municipal elections, as a member of the Shift Netherlands, I developed sort of a measurement tool on the right to housing for political programs for the municipal elections, and that was very much targeted towards what can you expect from your municipality to do in order to respect, protect, and the right to and fulfill the right to housing. So that certainly in the Netherlands, in the way we are organized, not only on housing but certainly also on homelessness, for example, a lot of responsibility lies indeed with municipalities, and that's where you can really change policies and do interventions that have impact at the local level. At the same time, from a human rights perspective, you hold the state accountable. So you also hold national government accountable, and national government should have a structure in which they can monitor and make sure that all of those decentralized institutions are also respecting, protecting, and fulfilling the right to housing. But Mustafa can maybe...
What can I say more about? Of course, a lot of relies on the policy of the municipality, but as Jan also stated, that the bus stops at Hugo de Jonge. He is systemic, accountable for the system. So I think a lot of laws are being made in The Hague. So I think a lot of the solutions also have to come from The Hague.
I was thinking about Leilani because she wanted to say something, and we did like 5 questions or something. So can you please?
Yeah, my point from before is not relevant to this conversation, so I'll leave it behind maybe, but it was related to what was being said at the time. But just on this last point, you know, it's super important to see the interaction between the different levels of government, particularly local government and national government. And to, like, cities, I think, have a tremendous amount of power, way more than people think, and then cities will admit. Sometimes they don't have the resources to do what they want to do. Sometimes they do. Sometimes it's about refraining from the negative things that they're doing, which doesn't cost anything. But also cities have a really strong, I don't know if you want to call it a carrot or a stick, with national government. Because when governments are reviewed for their compliance with international human rights, it tends to be the national government that comes under the fire, you know? They go to Geneva, there's a committee there, every 5 years reviews countries, and we'll be reviewing Netherlands to say, you are or you are not meeting your international human rights obligations with respect to housing. So city governments are in a very good position to say to national level government where they need resources or competencies that they don't already have, to say, hey, look, your policy on migrants and refugees is making it really difficult for me to realize the right to housing. And when I don't realize the right to housing at the local level, you get critiqued at the international level. So you, national government, have a vested interest in ensuring me, local government, can do what I need to do to implement the right to housing. And I'm always telling city governments they need to leverage they can leverage human rights to their advantage to do what they know they need to do to properly house populations and keep their populations healthy. It's not often discussed, this dynamic between the local and the national, and using international law in that way. But I think it can be useful.
Yeah, thank you. Is there someone who likes to comment on this, or maybe have a question? I saw to.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a bit separate, but also connected. I just thought we haven't spoken very much tonight about tax, and tax seems to me like a kind of key instrument for diminishing the attractiveness of housing as an asset. And I wondered if anyone has looked at that or seen any studies of kind of how property tax is applied in different cities or different countries. Because I guess one issue about saying that cities have the agency to kind of do something about this is that they're all competing with each other, right? They all want the people with the fancy jobs to move to their city so that they increase their tax base through employment. So if Amsterdam, for example, increased its property taxes on 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th homes, that would make it less attractive for people. That's it. So I'm wondering at what scale you would need to put in place effective property taxes to make it effective. Basically, maybe it's even at the European scale. Maybe this is a question for Kim.
Hi. We don't have the competence to put taxes forward. Unfortunately, member states really like to do that themselves. However, I do think that it's very important that we talk indeed about taxation. And I think specifically in the Netherlands, as in many other member states, we have this problem where social housing providers are being taxed for on their income from rent, and private investors are not. And I mean, just this fact is already, I think, mind-boggling. And I think it's very important that we, see the income from rents also as something that should be taxable. And I think that is already would create a very different kind of atmosphere and incentive around taxation. But I think indeed property tax is also an important discussion to have. It always really depends per member state how that works. There's in certain cities you can really put it everywhere on a local level as well, and you do see it works. So, but I think always this should also go hand in hand with the obligation to live in property and making sure that they are not just standing there empty and are being used.
Thank you, Kim. Do you have your answer? Yes. Then there's a question here.
Thank you. My name is Margreet. I'm both a politician and a lawyer. And yes, it is important to do something on taxes, although I think it's very difficult to do it on a local level because we have some property tax, but, well, the rules of the scope in which governments, local governments can act are very small, I think, and we have the problem that if they rise them, it will automatically be transformed in the rent, so that's a big problem. My question was more to Rosa. It's from my lawyer's background. You said that, well, it's a problem that the right to housing is a very vague, and it's a social right and not a classic human right. But I think, my question is, for example, the right to a healthy environment is also not a classic human right, and there has been quite some case law now where it's acknowledged, and it big cases, both by the European Court but also on a local level, and it has been done because there were classic rights were read into the right to a healthy environment. And my question is, do you see possibilities to do so for the right to housing? For example, using the right to non-discrimination, using the right to personal integrity for not living on the streets, using the right to be not exposed to violence in the case law, just to build more, to give more substance to the right to housing.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point that you're making. As far as I know, the most case law I'm aware of the right to a healthy environment is kind of enshrined in the right to family life and private life, at least in the European Convention. And there is also case law on the right to housing under that same right. It's just, but Jan always knows more about this than myself. The situations are, for example, when it's really about, the case law is really about evictions in situations that are not easily found parallels here. For example, an eviction of an entire camp of Roma Sinti with bulldozers, and it's just very limited in that sense. But I do think that what you're saying, especially the right to non-discrimination and other affiliated rights could give much more substance, and we would need that also. So I'm happy to talk a bit more about this if there is drinks afterwards. Yes, thank you.
Can I just add a couple of things?
Yes, of course.
I want, just on this point, the case that I mentioned that I worked on here in Canada that didn't work, we actually used the right to equality and the right to life and security of the person, because in our constitution in Canada, we don't have the right to housing as a specifically enumerated right. And I do think there is scope. I wrote a whole report as special rapporteur on the right to life and the right to housing and its intersections and where that's being used in different jurisdictions across the world. So Rosa, you might find it interesting, a little bit dated now, but still of interest. I wanted to speak to, I think it was Alice's comment about taxes, just to say a couple things. One, different taxes at the local level are being used where cities have those competencies. So a vacant home tax in Vancouver, for example, what is a 1% vacant home tax? It's generated a lot of money, and that money is going directly back into affordable housing. Singapore has, of course, what Alice had suggested, a property tax on second and third properties, and that has curbed investment in properties to some degree. LA, Los Angeles is looking at a new tax for sale of homes over a certain price, and it's going to generate billions because, of course, in LA there are so many mansions, et cetera, if that passes. So just to say, but what I would say to taxes is what we actually need to do is to reimagine our economies. Taxes are like a little bit tinkering at the margins, trying to get governments to sort of fix, little pieces that are broken, or to use this as a fix. But really, we need to reimagine economies so that we are producing economies that, or creating economies that produce value, and the value should be human rights outcomes. So we actually need a real shift in that way, I think. Taxes is a small tool, but to me, what we really need to do is start this reimagining.
Thank you, Leilani. There is a question here. Hi.
Hi. Yeah, quite a big question maybe, but because I heard was being talked about that we need to keep a connection through the bigger scale and the local scale, and I was wondering about squatting. Actually, that's kind of fighting for house rights on a local, smaller scale. But how is that connection with the bigger scale? Because I think legalizing squatting is something that needs to happen, and how can there be focus on that on a bigger scale, as a European or global scale?
Is there someone you'd like to ask this question to?
I think it's a general question.
It's a general question. Is there someone who likes to respond? Rosa? No?
I'm not sure if I'm the right person to answer this question, but I'm always dreaming about the case of ending squatting, anti-squatting law. I just didn't figure it out yet, so maybe it's more someone from the political side to answer.
Well, I mean, locally in the Netherlands, there's some interesting jurisprudence popping up now, which is of course instigated by squatters because they squat and they go to court. And there's some judgments that indicate, if these squatters are squatting this house under certain conditions, because otherwise they would be homeless, then their right to housing prevails over the right to property. I think that's really, really interesting. And I'm looking very much at Leilani and Kim perhaps also at understanding if that has any, if you can find any ground in international human rights language or in other mechanisms where you can make that a more general statement, where you can really use it in court on a more on a bigger scale. But at least at the local level, squatters are already motivating this discussion, hopefully also on a political level, to what Rosa said, to look at anti-squatting laws and also look at the leegstandswet and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, Kim's light's going out again.
Kim has signed out.
Yeah, Kim's like, no, that's not for me.
Or it's the parliament's energy saving policy.
GroenLinks, of course. Do you want to answer this question as well, or do you want to say something about?
Um, yeah, I was thinking about it, but from a European level, as I said, it's really not in our competences, so I find it really hard to have a good answer. Maybe Leilani can give some more insight on the international level.
Yeah, Leilani.
What's interesting, I was in a conversation earlier today with an advocate from South Africa, and we were talking about the idea of progressive realization. So the right to housing should be realized progressively over time, concrete measures in as little time as possible, but over time. And we were discussing, well, how much time? What is progressive? And if someone is unhoused for 5 years, 10 years, like, isn't time up? And so that to me lends itself to this idea of squatting. And that's where our conversation went when I was speaking with this fellow. It's like, well, wait a second, then if like people surely have the right to house themselves, especially when governments have dragged their feet, not just dragged their feet, undertaken steps that undermine the right to housing, that keep people unhoused, like undocumented migrants, for example. So I think there's something rich to explore there, Jan. I think, and recently someone asked me in Scotland, like, what do you think? Do you think we have the right to squat? And I feel like under international law, we can start making those arguments.
Thank you. Is that something? Yeah, nice. Let's see. Jolien, is there time for one more question? Yeah.
I have a question for Leilani. Yes, for Leilani. I don't know how.
Leilani.
Leilani. Is there a country which complies with rights, actually, with the human rights at the moment? Or can you give some examples of a right policy? What kind of policies do you?
Yeah. So every country, there's room for improvement, of course. But we normally would look to Finland in terms of addressing homelessness, for example, because they are one of the few countries in the world set to end homelessness by, they say, 2027. So before the European 2030 commitment. They have, obviously, the right to housing in their constitution, like most European countries. There is a culture there of understanding that living rough and living for a long period of time in a shelter is violative of human rights. That's in their culture. And so in that way, I love the Finnish example. It's not to say that they're perfect, and it's not to say that they don't have the threats of financialization and commodification nipping at their heels. They're a little behind because Finland has better tenant protections than some states, and also is not a sought after country in terms of a place to locate investment, but that's changing. It changed with COVID, of course, because now it's a different world. So Finland is where I would point the finger specifically with respect to homelessness. There are lots of cool things happening at local levels in different jurisdictions, Barcelona, Berlin. I mean, there are cool things. What we don't have, though, is enough right to housing across the board, national level, rights-based housing strategies. Most governments don't have them. They have strategies, but not rights-based ones. So there's still so much work to do. I wish I had kind of better news, but.
Thank you. Is there maybe one more question? No? Then I'm going to thank Kim and Leilani for joining us this evening through Zoom. Thanks so much. Bye-bye. And I want to thank my guests here for their story. And yeah, I'm just so happy that you were here tonight. So thank you so much. And of course, you guys, so thank you for that as well. And have a nice evening.